In this class, we'll deal with one of the most important factors for our happiness: relationships. We will soon see how relationships are important to us and why they are so important to us. And then we'll see how we can transform our relationships to make them more happy and more fulfilled. In particular, we will first look at what not to do. 4 behaviors that can, with up to 94% accuracy, predict divorce. But after that, we will turn to the happiest couples and look at what they do differently and learn how we can nurture happy and fulfilled relationships. We will start off this section by taking a closer look at another research study, the Harvard Man study. This is not just any study, but it's one of the longest running and most ambitious psychological studies of all time. The Harvard Man study ran over 75 years and followed young men from Harvard University and the city of Boston throughout their whole lives. Altogether, more than 700 men participated. It started shortly after they entered college in the 1930s and ended just a few years ago. The goal was to identify the life circumstances and personal characteristics that distinguish the happiest, most fulfilled man from the least happy and least successful ones. In his conclusion, after almost 3/4 of a century of research, George Wayland, the principal investigator, concluded with these words. He said, "We have 70 years of evidence that our relationships with other people matter, and matter more than anything else in the world." And he's not the only one to say this. Another study, very aptly called Very Happy People, by 2 of the leading researchers in the field, looked at more than 200 people and wanted to find out what do the top 10% in terms of happiness do differently than the rest and the least happy people. When they compared them, they found that the happiest respondents did not exercise significantly more. They did not participate in religious activities significantly more, or experience more objectively defined good events, like getting a promotion or something like this. It turned out that there was only one factor that distinguished the happiest 10% from the rest. The only factor that was consistently different was that the happiest 10% had very good social relationships. Having good social relationships was not sufficient for being happy, but it was necessary. So there is only one thing that it seems impossible to miss out on if you want to be very happy. We need to have fulfilling relationships to be very happy and to thrive. These 2 studies that I just told you about provide very strong support. But they're not the only studies. There are hundreds of more that show how social relationships are linked to longevity, lower stress, improved overall well-being, and so on and so on. But to find out why relationships are so crucial for our well-being, we have to turn to evolutionary psychology. Because we human beings have an innate need to form social bonds and connect with other people. It is literally wired into our biology, because when we make a positive social connection, our body releases a chemical called oxytocin. That's a hormone and a neurotransmitter that induces pleasure and reduces our stress. That means that each positive social connection that we engage in throughout our day bolsters our immune system. We literally get more resilient, more resistant, physically, but also psychologically, towards stresses, towards adversities that we have to face throughout our day. And these research findings are true for relationships in general. For our friends and family, for our romantic partners, just as much as for colleagues at work or people in our community that we interact with. Throughout the rest of this class, we will engage specifically with marriages and romantic relationships. But nevertheless, most things that I'm gonna tell you are also true for relationships with friends and other family members. It is the same underlying principles that govern our romantic relationships that make also our normal, non-romantic relationships more fulfilling and more fulfilled. So let's start off with how not to do it. John and Julie Gottman, two acclaimed love scientists, identified the so-called 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. These are 4 kinds of behaviors that allow them to predict with up to 94% accuracy if a couple is heading for divorce, just by observing them in their laboratory. So they bring in 2 couples, have them talk about certain kind of topics that are relevant for the relationships, and just by the behavior the couple exhibits to each other, they can say with up to 94% accuracy if they are going to divorce within the next 5 years. That is incredible. And these 4 types of behavior is what they called the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And we're going to take a look at them more closely. The first of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse is criticism. In the worst relationships, partners really often point with fingers at each other and are very critical. There's an attitude that is kind of diagnosing their partner's defects, personality defects. When they complain, they use words such as always or never. Like, you never listen to me, or how could you forget this? You're such an ignorant person. So criticism is not framed in the behavior of the other person. It's targeted to the personality of the other person. The best predictor for a divorce is a behavior they call contempt. That's the second of the horsemen of the apocalypse. Contempt, that's when partners have an attitude of superiority towards one another. For example, you think you're more intelligent than your partner, or you're more punctual than your partner. And these attitudes often express as hostility, mockery, and disgust. This is the worst of the 4 horsemen, and almost certainly leads to divorce or breakup. The third horseman of the apocalypse is called stonewalling. That's a term John and Julie Gottman used for people who are withdrawing from conflict. Withdrawing from conflict up to an extent where it's not clear anymore if they are actually even listening. So a stonewaller is really tuned out of a conversation. The fourth and last one of the 4 horsemen is defensiveness. People become defensive and say, it's not my fault, it's yours, and start a counterattack. Or they present themselves as an innocent victim. The best and most fulfilled relationships, however, do exactly the opposite. They are open to criticism and take it as interesting feedback, what their partner tells about them, or tells to them. So these 4 horsemen are the most detrimental behaviors for a relationship. But there are other things as well. John Gottman studied marriages for decades now, and he, for example, also observed that about 70% of the conflicts that married couples face are perpetual conflicts that can never be resolved. So how do they know that? They studied a set of marriages over a 4-year period, coded the conflicts, every single word that they heard. And to their surprise, only 30% of the problems were specific to a given situation. The rest were associated with basic differences in personality, or differences that are closely tied to each partner's concept of who they are and what they think of themselves as a person. But guess what? Getting a different partner doesn't free you from perpetual conflict. You just trade in one set and get back another. There is a serious misconception when it comes to relationships, especially among young people, that see romantic relationships as a matter of finding the right person, the one perfect man or woman with whom we will be happily forever. But this is a flawed idea. It's just as much a myth of happiness as the one we talked about in the beginning. Relationship researchers have consistently proven that the most important part of being happily together is the process of being together and not the finding of the right partner. This is not to say that we can be with any person in the world. That would be neither true. But at the same time, it's not about finding this one right person. It's about making it work. It's about the process. So this process is what positive psychology is taking a closer look at. It wants to understand the process of being together happily. Remember, at the beginning of this whole course, when we looked at what positive psychology actually is, what kind of question it is asking? Let's go back there for a second. We said that the difference of positive psychology to the traditional psychological approach is that it operates on a health model rather than the disease model. That means it looks at strengths, competencies, and pursuing happiness. And this is also something that we have to do when we look at relationships. John Gottman said, "At first, when I figured out how to predict divorce, I thought I had found the key to saving marriages. But like so many experts before me, I was wrong. I was not able to crack the code to saving marriages until I started to analyze what went right in happy marriages." Positive psychology's question is, what makes some relationships thrive and grow stronger over time? This is the questions we're going to ask now. We are going to tackle this question by using the mining model of relationship development. A researcher called Harvey developed it and identified 5 specific components of successful, fulfilling relationships. Couples looking to improve their relationships may look at this model as a bit of a guide on how to understand what a truly healthy relationship can look like. It is important to note that no one can do this perfectly, and most couples have issues in some dimensions. So take this as an ideal model and try to learn from it, because one of the reasons why positive psychology exists is because we want to learn from the best. The 5 dimensions in the mining model of relationships are knowing and being known, benefit finding with the other partner, as we talked in the beginning, accepting, equality of the partners, and finally, understanding the relationship as a journey. So let's together look at these in turn. Knowing and being known is about learning about each other. It's about really getting to know each other deeply and meaningfully. Couples who are thriving really understand each other. They understand each other's thoughts and feelings, attitudes, and past history. What is essential is to keep up a desire to understand each other. This is rather easy at the beginning of a relationship, but the longer the relationship lasts, and this is then especially true for marriages, the more challenging it becomes, because we tend to take one another for granted. We tend to think that we already know. We already know what this person wants and thinks and likes. The key is to keep on being interested. There is always something new to discover. There's always something new to learn about the other person, because everybody's developing and nobody stays the same. We're constantly evolving, our dreams change, our goals change. And in order to really be known by the other person, we must open up. We must really open up and be vulnerable to the other person. there is a great book that I very recommend you, which goes very much into detail about being vulnerable and how this can affect every part of our life. It's Brené Brown, and she talks about daring greatly. You will find a link in the resources. Summing up, the first part, knowing and being known, really requires us to open up, to spend time with one another, and be interested in one another, and be willing to be vulnerable, so you can really be known by the other person. Secondly, it turns out that people in the most fulfilling relationship engage in something that we already discussed: benefit finding. Remember, in the fourth lecture, we looked at how we can see the same things from different angles. We can focus on each other's weaknesses or each other's faults. We can focus on the other person's mistakes, or we can focus on their good intentions, for example. So benefit finding is also crucial in relationships. It's about focusing on what works and what is good. What also matters a lot in this respect is how we explain our partner's behavior to ourselves. What works well is attributing positive behavior to the character and the intentions of our partner, and attributing negative behavior to external circumstances. And to do this until we're proven wrong. So, in essence, benefit finding here asks us to give our friends and our partners the benefit of the doubt. If you try this in your personal life, you can see how this gradually can transform your life. Because if you believe that people have good intentions, you will see also this can be a self-fulfilling prophecy. The third part of a fulfilling relationship is acceptance and respect. Acceptance and respect are necessary, even or perhaps especially in an argument. Relationship masters aim to listen to each other respectfully, accept the other person's responses, and work out compromises. It's perfectly healthy to complain about something specific, but not criticize the whole person. Remember, this is exactly the opposite to the criticism part in the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Well-functioning couples do not allow negativity to become habitual. They use rewards rather than punishments in an argument. Researchers, for example, also found that happy couples have a ratio of negative to positive exchanges of 1 to 5. That doesn't mean that there is no conflict, which is actually an important part, but there is much more positive communication than negative communication and conflict. But this acceptance and respect is not only during conflict. Fulfilled relationships are about much more than simply handling conflict well. And one of the defining characteristics of a lastingly happy relationship is the way partners or friends respond when they receive good news. A researcher in California called Shelley Gable suggests that supporting partners when good things happen is as important in building relationships as supporting them when bad things happen. What she found in the research is that couples with strong relationships have a particular way of responding to each other when good things happen. Here's a matrix that shows us the 4 different types of responses that we can give to good news. The most productive and positive response is what we call active and constructive in the upper left corner. To understand all of them, let's consider an example. Active and constructive when, let's say, your partner comes home and tells you about a promotion they got. Active constructive responding would be, that's great, that's awesome, tell me more about it, I know you've been working so hard for it. Wow, so where were you when they told you? Tell me exactly, tell me everything about it. You're enthusiastic about it, you maintain eye contact, and you display positive emotions, this is what's called active and constructive, and this is what makes relationships flourish. The most common way to respond is passive constructive. That's saying something like, "That's good news. I'm happy for you. That's great." There's little energy, the response may be a little bit delayed, and there's little nonverbal communication. The active destructive way to respond will be something along the lines of, "Ooh, that sounds like a lot of responsibility to take on. There will probably be more stress now. You will have to work longer. Do you at least get more paid?" The passive destructive is not even acknowledging the good news. It's saying something like, "What's for dinner?" or simply leaving the room. You may want to try to incorporate a more active, constructive way of responding to other people's, your friends, your partner's good news, to show sincere enthusiasm for a good event. Being excited, being happy for the other person, and showing genuine interest in the good event that's described by them. These are the things that over time make a relationship grow, make a relationship more positive and more flourishing. The fourth part relates to a sense of equality in the relationship, that one gives into the relationship is approximately equal to what one gets out of a relationship. A relationship is working well when nobody is taking advantage of. Distribution of housework can be an example. While it is perfectly okay to take on certain roles, for convenience, for example, or because the other person doesn't like one or the other thing, doing so has to involve respect, recognition, and appreciation. However, that does not mean that we have to keep a tab on things. That's very detrimental. That's bad for a relationship. Instead, the happy couples just do things because they feel happy about the relationship and happy about doing them. But overall, there has to be a sense of equality, a sense of mutual respect and appreciation. Last but not least, the most happy relationships understand that the relationship is a journey. Minding is a process rather than a final destination, and it requires time and continuity. This process never stops because the relationship is always developing. People are always developing, adjusting to new information, changes, and changes in life cycles also. Because we grow older, we reach different levels of maturity. So for this, I very strongly encourage you to build positive relationship rituals. And you will have a bunch of these, a bunch of suggestions in your resources. I will just repeat, because it's so important, that in essence, these points are true for both fulfilled marriages and romantic relationships, as well as for lifelong friendships and fulfilling relationships with other family members or work colleagues. Those relationships matter more than anything else in the world for our well-being. Building, fulfilling, lasting relationships with our partner, family, and friends is likely to be one of the most effective strategies and ways to live a happy and fulfilled life.